School bullies have no idea they just messed with a Mafia boss's son. Imagine being humiliated every day, suffering taunts, shoves, and cruel laughter. Now imagine that without knowing it, these bullies chose the worst possible person to torment, the son of one of the most feared Mafia bosses in the city. They thought he was weak. They thought they could walk all over him without consequences, but they were about to learn the truth in the worst way possible. This is the story of how a group of school bullies learned that some people should never be messed with. The school hallways buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Students laughing, lockers slamming, footsteps echoing off the tile floors. Among the sea of familiar faces, a new presence went almost unnoticed. Tony Moretti walked through the front doors of Westwood High with his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear expensive clothes or boast about his background. He was just another transfer student, quiet and unassuming. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. But if anyone had taken a closer look, they might have noticed the way he moved. Calm, controlled, always aware of his surroundings. He had grown up with a set of rules drilled into him since childhood. Never draw unnecessary attention, never start a fight, and never ever show weakness. For Tony, this school was supposed to be a fresh start. His father had insisted on it. "You need to learn how to live outside of our world," he had said in a low, firm voice. "Make friends, be normal." Tony knew that word didn't apply to him. He had seen too much, heard too much. He had spent nights in rooms filled with whispered conversations, had watched men lower their voices when his father entered a room. He had grown up understanding power in ways these high school kids couldn't begin to imagine, and yet to them, he was nobody, just another student. At least, that's what he had hoped. But some people, the kind who always looked for an easy target, had a way of sensing something different, something that made them curious, or worse, made them want to test their limits. And Tony was about to find out that some lessons were unavoidable. Tony had been at Westwood High for less than a week when he first caught their attention. It started with something small, shoulder bumps in the hallway, mocking whispers when he passed by. He ignored it. He had been taught patience, control. But bullies always escalated when they didn't get the reaction they wanted. The ringleader was a senior named Chad Miller, tall, athletic, and full of himself. He was the kind of guy who thrived on making others feel small. His crew, 3 other guys just as arrogant, fed off his energy, laughing at every insult, encouraging every push. Tony remained silent through it all. "Hey, new kid," Chad smirked one afternoon, cornering him near the lockers. "You deaf or just stupid?" Tony didn't flinch. He simply looked at him, his gaze calm, unreadable. That unsettled Chad more than an insult would have. "What's with the silent act?" another one of them sneered. "Too scared to talk?" Tony wasn't scared. He had seen real fear before, the kind that turned grown men pale, made their hands shake. He had heard desperate voices begging for mercy, had watched his father decide whether those pleas were worth listening to. Compared to that, Chad and his friends were nothing. But he couldn't react, not yet. So he let them talk, let them push him once, twice. He absorbed every insult, every cheap laugh, and still he said nothing. That was their mistake. They thought his silence meant weakness. They thought he was afraid. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Tony had endured worse. His entire life had been a lesson in restraint. He had learned from a young age that power wasn't about reacting, it was about control. His father had drilled that into him. A man who lets his emotions rule him is already defeated. So when Chad Miller and his gang pushed him in the hallways, when they knocked his books to the floor, when they whispered threats just loud enough for him to hear, Tony did what he was trained to do. He waited. He didn't fight back. He didn't argue. He didn't even acknowledge them. and that drove them crazy. Chad thrived on fear. He was used to kids begging him to stop, teachers looking the other way, the satisfaction of knowing he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. But Tony wasn't afraid, and the more he ignored them, the angrier they became. One afternoon in the cafeteria, Chad decided he had enough. Tony was sitting alone, eating in silence, when Chad and his crew walked up. "Look at this guy," Chad scoffed, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "All alone. No friends, no life. Maybe he doesn't even speak English." His friends laughed. Tony kept eating. Chad's smirk faltered. He hated being ignored. "What's the matter, huh? Cat got your tongue?" Still nothing. Chad's jaw clenched. He grabbed Tony's tray and flipped it, sending his food crashing onto his lap. The cafeteria went silent. Tony slowly looked down at his ruined clothes, then, just as calmly, he lifted his eyes to Ryan's. No anger, no fear, just a quiet, unreadable stare. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. For a second, it almost felt like he had made a mistake, but he shook it off. "Guess you'll have to clean that up, huh?" he sneered. "Maybe you should learn to speak if you want people to respect you." Tony exhaled slowly and stood up. The room was dead silent. He didn't retaliate, didn't even look at Ryan again. Instead, he walked out, leaving the mess behind. Ryan laughed, but it felt forced. He thought he had won. He had no idea that the game had just begun. Tony walked out of the cafeteria, his face unreadable, but inside, something had shifted. He had been patient. He had given them every chance to back off, but now they had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it slide. That night, as he sat at the dinner table, his father studied him carefully. Matteo Moretti was a man of few words, but his presence alone could silence a room. He had built an empire on discipline, respect, and an unshakable reputation. "You're quiet tonight," his father said, cutting into his steak. "Something happened?" Tony hesitated. "It's nothing." Matteo set his fork down. "You know better than to lie to me." Tony looked at him, debating whether to say anything. Finally, he exhaled. "Just some guys at school think they own the place. They've been messing with me." His father's expression didn't change. "Names?" Tony shook his head. "I can handle it." Matteo leaned back, watching him carefully. Handling it doesn't always mean doing nothing. Tony knew what that meant. His father had always taught him that there were two kinds of men in the world: those who let others walk over them, and those who reminded people why that was a bad idea. "I don't want to draw attention," Tony said. A small smirk played at the corner of Matteo's lips. "Attention is inevitable, son. The only question is who controls it." Tony thought about that for a long time. The next morning he walked into school with a different energy. He wasn't going to start a fight. He didn't need to. But he was going to make them regret ever thinking he was weak, and it would start today. The shift was subtle at first. Tony still moved the same way. Calm, controlled, deliberate. But something in his eyes had changed, and people noticed. Chad Miller and his crew had no idea, but the moment they flipped Tony's tray, their fates had already been sealed. They just hadn't realized it yet. That morning, as Chad walked through the halls, something felt off. Students whispered as he passed. Some avoided his gaze altogether. His usual confidence faltered, just for a second. Then, at his locker, he found the first sign, a single playing card tucked into the metal slats, the ace of spades. Chad frowned. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. One of his friends, Connor, snatched it from his hands and snickered. "Looks like someone's trying to scare you." But Chad wasn't laughing. Something about it felt deliberate. The unease grew throughout the day. In every hallway, every classroom, people kept stealing glances at him. By lunch, even his friends had started to notice. "All right, what is going on?" Chad finally snapped. That's when a sophomore, pale and nervous, hesitated before speaking. You don't know who he is, do you?" Chad frowned. "Who?" The kid swallowed hard. "Tony?" Chad scoffed. "Tony? The mute loser?" The boy shook his head. "Tony Moretti." For the first time, Chad hesitated. That name, Moretti, felt familiar, and then slowly the pieces started to fall into place. Moretti, as in Matteo Moretti? As in the Matteo Moretti, the man whose name was whispered in dark corners, the man whose enemies disappeared? Chad's face paled. That's not possible, he muttered. But it was, and the whole school already knew. Chad and his friends had spent weeks tormenting the one person they never should have touched, and now it was too late. Chad's stomach twisted as he walked through the halls, his mind racing. It had to be a joke, a sick rumor. There was no way. Tony wants to talk to you. The voice came from behind him. Chad turned sharply to see two guys he had never met before. They weren't students. They were older, mid-20s maybe, dressed too well for Westwood High, and their eyes, calm, calculating, made Chad's pulse spike. I don't know what you're talking about, Chad stammered. One of the men smirked. Sure you do. Let's take a walk. Chad swallowed hard. His friends were nowhere to be seen, the students around him pretending not to notice. No one was going to help him. The two men flanked him as they walked toward the back of the school, where the staff parking lot sat mostly empty. And there, leaning against a sleek black car, was Tony. Except this wasn't the same Tony Chad had tormented. This Tony was relaxed, his arms crossed, watching Chad with an expression that sent ice down his spine. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even smirking, he was just waiting. Chad stopped a few feet away, his throat dry. Look, man, I didn't. You talk too much, Tony interrupted. Chad shut up immediately. Tony stepped forward. You thought I was weak. Chad didn't respond. What could he say? You wanted to humiliate me, Tony continued, his voice even. You wanted to make an example out of me. Now I'll return the favor. Chad felt the blood drain from his face. I didn't mean anything by it. Tony tilted his head slightly, as if considering that. Then he leaned in just enough for Chad to hear his next words clearly. I could ruin you, he said softly, and I wouldn't even have to touch you. Chad shivered. He believed him. Tony stepped back. But I won't. Chad blinked, confused. Tony smirked for the first time. Because you're already finished. Chad didn't understand until he checked his phone an hour later. His father had left 5 missed calls, his mother had sent frantic texts, and then the final blow, a single message from an unknown number. Tell your father to be more careful with his business. Accidents happen. Chad felt his entire world tilt. He hadn't just messed with some nobody, he had stepped on the toes of the one person who could make his entire family disappear, and now he would live the rest of his life knowing it. Ryan never touched Tony again. In fact, he barely spoke at all after that day. The once cocky bully walked through the halls of Westwood High like a ghost, silent, pale, always looking over his shoulder. His friends distanced themselves, sensing something had changed. They didn't know the details, but they knew enough. Tony, on the other hand, went back to his quiet routine. He didn't gloat, he didn't brag, he didn't need to. Power wasn't about being loud, it wasn't about throwing punches. It was about knowing when to act, and how to make sure it never happened again. Ryan learned that the hard way. And Tony? He had just proven to himself and to his father that he didn't need to be like the men he had grown up around to be respected. Sometimes fear was louder than violence, and in the right hands, silence was the most powerful weapon of all.